welcome you to Core Volunteer Training, which is a program created to help our supporters, especially newer volunteers, as well as emerging group leaders, to connect with each other around the world and empower you to achieve your larger goals for climate advocacy. This week's topic is the economics of carbon fee and dividend policies. I'm your host, as I said, Tamara Staten. I am CCL's Education and Resilience Coordinator and also have the honor of being our regional coordinator for the Greater Pacific Northwest. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to jump into our 3 learning goals for this evening. If we've done our job, then you, at the end of the evening, will, number 1, understand the rationale for the 3 legs of CCL's flagship carbon fee and dividend policy. I will describe, I shouldn't say we, one of us, Bob, very likely, whom I will introduce very shortly here, will describe each of the legs in his words, and we hope that you will be able to describe them then later in your own words and how it would function within the United States. And we hope to help you understand how to address economic issues related to each leg, often raised by others with questions. So with that, I am going to introduce Bob, who is our speaker, Bob Archer. He is an economist by training with a BA from Yale and a master's from the University of Pittsburgh. Bob is a former Peace Corps volunteer and worked on energy reforms, regulatory development, and energy efficiency in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, South and Southeast Asia with USAID, Agency for International Development. He comes to us tonight with over 30 years of experience working on economic policy for national and Washington, D.C. interests, and he now spends his time generously volunteering for CCL and serves on the steering committee of the Marin, California CCL chapter, and is the leader of the CCL Economic Policy Network action team. Tonight's agenda is pretty straightforward. After a short introduction about the general public perception about carbon taxes, Bob will give you the why, or the rationale for each element of CCL's 3-part policy, including how it works, why it's important, and naturally the economic issues which are often congressional concerns. He'll also give you an opportunity to weigh in at times with your ideas and thoughts. We'll make time for questions after each section, after the fee, the dividend, and the regulations and subsidies section at the end to answer any remaining questions. All right, Bob, it's all you.
Welcome all. And I think this is a good time to get into these issues we'll talk about tonight. The debate on climate policy is a very lively one. And there is a fair bit of misunderstanding and misinformation in this process. And I hope this presentation will give you some of the tools to respond to those as you get into the substantive discussion of the carbon fee and dividend and border carbon adjustment. I would like to start out with 2 slides to provide context. The first one is that the challenge is global. That slide is up, Tamara?
Yep.
Okay. And that challenge is that there are billions of individuals, millions of firms, thousands of governments, hundreds of nations, and for them to take action, they're going to have incentives. We can raise the price of goods and services that are carbon intensive. That's Nobel economist William Nordhaus. The policies that the U.S. puts in place must be workable in developing countries where most climate emissions are occurring. This global perspective is both the starting and ending point for this discussion. The second slide shows people's concerns about a carbon tax, and you hear these points made today by critics of a carbon fee. A synthesis of 26 studies was done to identify how to make carbon taxes more acceptable. The slide shows the 4 main concerns people have: that the personal costs are too high, it's going to hurt low-income households, they don't trust government, that they just want the revenues, and it's not effective in discouraging high carbon behavior. The beauty of the CCL policy is that the first three of these are addressed directly by the equitable dividend. The study found that number 4, the lack of understanding that a carbon fee reduces emissions, leads people to favor spending revenues on clean energy projects instead of a carbon dividend, which hurts low and middle income households. The good news is that when people understand that the fee reduces emissions, the dividend becomes the preference over clean energy expenditures. So we in CCL need to communicate that the carbon fee is effective and revenues should protect low and middle income households. Here are 5 more commonly repeated misconceptions about the CCL policy you may have heard. The first 2 are quite common: that the carbon fee is politically toxic, costs up front, and benefits are in the distance and diffuse. And the second one, that disadvantaged communities will be hurt by a carbon fee. This webinar should give you the knowledge to respond to these misconceptions. Let's start with the basic economics underpinning the carbon pollution fee. The next slides describe the key impacts of the fee, that is behavioral change among consumers, innovators, utilities, industries, and investors. Why a carbon pollution fee? You raise the price of fossil fuels and demand goes down and emissions go down. This connection is not sufficiently understood or accepted. 2 behavior changes occur by people, businesses, investors, and the like: conservation and substitution of cleaner, cheaper alternatives. The main reason, the fundamental economic justification for a carbon fee, is that our climate problem is essentially due to a major market failure in negative external costs falling on us. When a factory dumps its pollution, such as carbon dioxide, in the air and water, the costs fall on us, not them. This is a negative economic externality. Without a carbon fee, we are subsidizing the fossil fuel industry to a massive degree. So there's no incentive for the polluter to change. CCL's carbon fee puts the cost back on the cause of pollution, fossil fuels. So to date, the focus has been on the power of the fee to reduce emissions. But there's a second and very important impact: the power to accelerate clean energy innovation. There's a point of view that government R&D is all we need, no carbon fee. However, a widely held view among academics, industry, and innovators is that a carbon fee will accelerate innovation and speed market adoption by providing strong incentives and by making fossil fuels more expensive. In the last 2 or 3 years, the issue of redirecting financing has moved to the front. Today, most financing and investment is misallocated because fossil fuels are underpriced, making such investments misleadingly attractive. A carbon fee on fossil fuels will provide the financial sector more accurate information and steer financing into low and no carbon options. The Commodities Future Trading Commission put this forward as one of their very primary recommendations. So the carbon fee. CCL supports a fee starting at $15 a ton of CO2, rising $10 each year or $15 a year if emission targets aren't met. Now, why do you want a predictable rising fee? Any carbon pricing policy won't do. The great power of CCL's policy is a predictable, visible, rising price. Note that I said predictable and visible. It sends a powerful economy-wide signal for investment and innovation, unlike regulation or cap and trade, which have not provided the trajectory, predictability, or environmental certainty as academic theory contends. Why would you start low and escalate gradually? You want to avoid the economic shock and early political backlash. British Columbia and Canada started low, and they have a rising carbon fee, and they've avoided that backlash. It allows planning, long-term planning and economic adjustment by industry and households, and it provides that clear long-term signal to get the largest household behavior response, which is known as tax salience. What is tax salience? It's a field of economic research that shows that people are more likely to change their behavior in response to highly visible and highly salient, meaning it impacts them, salient taxes compared to their response to traditional market swings in prices like gasoline. Carbon fee critics who claim the fee won't impact behavior on car purchases and use are looking backward at traditional gasoline market prices, which fluctuate up and down, not the magnified impact of the fee due to tax salience. And there are several more reasons for supporting a carbon fee versus the alternatives. And in particular, the last one is least considered. A good fit for developing countries that many have to deal with weakened institutions, corruption, and inequality. Administration of the fee, use the existing IRS and Treasury Department procedures, no new bureaucracies. Now, where is the fee applied? It's upstream is the term. That is as close to the mine, the well, and the point of importation. It's not at the gas pump or your electric bill. For coal, the fee could have been imposed at the mine or approximately 500 coal preparation plants. There's already an IRS Form 720. You just add a line to that for the carbon fee. Oil and gas, there are about 140 refineries and 500 natural gas processing plants where it could be applied. The bottom line is it's manageable. The fee impact on emissions will be significant. The Stanford modeling form forecasts 25 to 50% approximately by 2030, exceeding Paris Accord requirements. And the Columbia University study shows the price ranges to achieve net zero in 2050, right about where CCL's carbon fee will be in 25 and 2030, $55 to $105 a ton. I like this example in the United Kingdom of the impact of a carbon fee. They imposed a carbon tax on coal and gas for power generation, which caused an 85% decline in coal use from 2014 to 2017. They imposed it on top of the European Union cap and trade program, which was fairly stagnant. The experience also provides an important political lesson. The UK green organizations like Greenpeace opposed it initially, and after success, advocated for continuing it. You'll hear critics say this is going to impact households, which is true, but it's relatively capable of being absorbed, and the dividend figures into this. Household energy costs will rise approximately 5 to 10% with the initial $15 fee. This will stimulate awareness and initiation of change behavior without the economic shock and political backlash. The average US home energy bill is about $2,000 a year. Heating, cooling, water heating, appliance, lighting, electronics. So a 10% increase is $206 a year. The first year dividend would be approximately $750 for a family of 4. So the rising costs will be more than covered. Let me stop here for about 30 seconds and ask you a question. And please type your responses in the chat. We know costs will increase for fossil fuels and for the products made from fossil fuels. So what share of the increase in overall household costs do you think will come from products, stuff, rather than fuels? 25% due to products and stuff, 50% or 75%? It's close to 75% of the CO2 impact comes from stuff. And I'll mention this again when we get to the difference in the impact on rural, suburban, and urban areas. So the fuel issue, while it is greatly in the public eye, really constitutes 7% of our total household consumption on average. What's the impact of a carbon fee on economies? And so we've heard the narrative that a carbon tax is a job and economy killer. And today we depended upon climate economic models to refute this, but that's changed. Gilbert Metcalf at Tufts University and a CCL advisory board member, along with James Stack at Harvard, published their research on the actual carbon tax impact in 31 European countries on economic growth and jobs. The results were encouraging, had basically no negative impact. In other words, there's no basis for the view that carbon tax kills growth or jobs. Next is the impact on inflation, which is obviously a concern today. While some theoretical modeling shows modest inflationary impacts on a carbon tax, an initial analysis of Europe and British Columbia find that carbon taxes have not been inflationary. And CCL has the strongest case for addressing inflation. The household dividend will help the bottom 2/3 of households come out ahead. Jobs, it's a big issue and a big narrative for the current administration. A carbon fee steers investment to clean energy. You get 2 to 5 times more jobs in clean energy for every $1 million invested than in the fossil fuel industry. There are nearly 3 times as many clean energy jobs. So the trend is toward more jobs as labor-intensive clean energy growth and fossil jobs decline. It's not all rosy. There's a need for complementary policies to address the disproportionate regional impacts, such as West Virginia, Texas, and Detroit. For example, in Detroit, there are different job requirements. Electric cars require 30% less labor, something that has to be addressed. One of the things that academics, particularly political scientists who aren't as strong in economics as they should be, say, why are low prices why are carbon prices low around the world? That's because the first generation carbon tax policies and cap and trade policies did not protect households and industries, 2 major constituencies. There was no dividend and border carbon adjustment. So carbon tax critics cite low prices as a reason fee and dividend won't work. They're comparing basically old first generation carbon tax policies. That is, those with subnational coverage, no predictable rising price, no household dividend, and no border carbon adjustment. I consider our policy to be the 4th generation policy, a wide coverage of all fossil fuels, a rising fee, protection of the bottom 2/3 of households with a dividend and a border carbon adjustment. These latter 2 features rebut political scientists' claim that politicians won't support a carbon tax because of the supposed adverse impact on households and industries. Another false narrative is the view that industries will pass on all the carbon fees to consumers and continue their business as usual, polluting. That's not the case. A carbon fee affects all the decisions of industries, businesses, governments, utilities, consumers as they seek out least cost options. Some are affected greatly, some less so, but billions of investment and consumption decisions are affected every day. Most industries have to absorb some of the rising energy input costs, otherwise they lose customers. The study showed that selected industries pass on 25 to 75% of fossil energy costs to consumers, depending upon the industry's competitive position, market power, and availability of consumer alternatives. In addition, industry shifts some of the burden back to the fossil fuel industry suppliers by switching to clean energy suppliers. Now, some critics state that carbon pricing hurts disadvantaged communities. The term carbon pricing conflates two very different policies, cap and trade and carbon fee and dividend. The flaws of California's cap and trade and forest carbon offsets have been projected onto the fee and dividend policy. Environmental justice groups have legitimate concerns about cap and trade and carbon offsets, but those concerns are not applicable to the CCL carbon fee and dividend, which does not depend upon a carbon market and does not have forest carbon offsets of any kind. So here we are at the end of this first section, and there are 5 main economic takeaways. First, it's effective, which you'll see all over the CCL website. Second, innovation will take off. And third, health benefits, local pollution reduction, and other co-benefits not captured in the modeling will be significant. And fourth, the economy and jobs continue to grow. And fifth, the dividend brings about economic equity. Now, as we finish this section, take a few seconds and answer in the chat. What do you think are the 2 or 3 major benefits of the fee that might interest your congressional representative? Is it the emissions reduction, innovation, redirection of financing, ease of administration, the neutral impact on the economy, job? The second leg, the dividend, household dividend, or carbon cashback. I think now is the time for CCL to emphasize the importance of the dividend for inflation issues, household equity, and the long-term durability of the policy. Here's the basics. Who gets the dividend and how much? Based on our CCL trajectory, you get a full share for up to 2 adults, half share for children up to age 18. So a family of 4 get about $2,000 a year in year 3, over $3,000 in year 5, and approaching $4,000 a year in year 10. The total revenue, depending upon the trajectory that ultimately decided upon, is $500 billion to $2 trillion over 10 years. So you can understand the consequences and implication of that. So why a dividend as opposed to using all the revenues? Everyone has a view on the use of the revenues. So why a household dividend? It's the most equitable of all the climate policy and programs there are. And it brings long-term policy durability. People will like it and advocate for continuity of the fee. And it pumps money back into the economy at the consumer level, benefiting small and medium-sized businesses. It's important to note that the economist statement that can be found at econstatement.org, 3,500 some economists give priority to the dividend for the reasons of equity and sustainability, instead of offsetting corporate tax cuts to improve economic efficiency. This is a significant departure because economists love efficiency. Now, as I said, the dividend is the most equitable use of revenues. This next chart is from the Office of Tax Analysis at the Department of Treasury. Very serious group. And basically the bottom 2/3 of households generally break even or come out ahead. That is, the dividend equals or exceeds the increased cost of energies and products. The lower the household income, the more the disproportionate benefit they receive. I mentioned earlier this issue about rural versus urban divide. There's a perception and a narrative that says rural households are disproportionately affected by the fee because they drive more. But the CCL household impact study shows there's very little difference among rural, suburban, and urban households. The similarity in impact is because most of the carbon consumption, 70% or more for all groups, is due to stuff, consumer goods, and not direct fossil fuel use for driving longer distance, such as in rural households. And I mentioned before that fossil energy consumption by households constitutes about an average 7% of household income. In terms of the dividend and the policy overall, Canada's political success has been overlooked by environmentalist media, pundits, and our representatives, and it's a carbon tax success and refutes political scientists' claims that a carbon tax is politically impossible. Canada started with a carbon tax of about $20 a ton in April 2019, raising $10 a ton to about $50 a ton this year. And they have set a goal of a carbon tax of $135 a ton by 2030. $135 a ton. 90% of the tax revenues are now returned to households through a tax credit, and most households come out ahead. So how did this happen politically? And first, the 2019 federal election, right after the carbon tax was put in place, validated that tax despite strong conservative opposition. And second, when the annual increase took place in April 2020, during the coronavirus economic recession, it proved political durability. Prime Minister Trudeau was quoted as saying, "Our plan on pricing pollution puts more money up front into people's pockets than they would pay with a new price on pollution. We're going to continue to focus on putting more money in people's pockets to support them right across the country." The power of that dividend concept. And third, in 2021, the Supreme Court upheld the carbon tax. Fourth, the Conservative Party came out in favor of it, against it, partly in favor of it, and they're in turmoil fighting over the policy. And very importantly, finally, Canada will shift to a quarterly check in the mail this year, a true dividend, because people were unaware of a tax credit on their tax form. And I think a good deal of the credit goes to CCL Canada on getting that point across. Okay, the third leg, the border carbon adjustment. This is, I think, in many ways, a must-have feature to succeed on a global basis. And then this part of the CCL policy is gaining some public bipartisan support as well. So why do you do this? There are three key reasons. You want to avoid the loss of jobs and US competitiveness, big issue with Congress. Want to avoid US industries moving to countries with no carbon price. That's called leakage. And this mechanism will leverage other countries to adopt a comparable carbon price to our price. As previously mentioned, the household dividend addresses the fairness issue for households, and this border carbon adjustment addresses the fairness issue for industry. This is an important and current issue. Now that the EU is moving to a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, they call it, and others are interested, the US must put in place both a carbon fee and a border carbon adjustment. It's likely many countries will try to avoid imposing their own carbon price and let others carry the burden. They are free riders. This is a common term in trade economics. Research and experience on economic trade shows that idealistic ambition, such as in the Paris Agreement, will not be sufficient to get countries to implement significant climate programs. So what is a border carbon adjustment? It has two parts, basically. Essentially, a tariff placed on goods imported into the US from countries without an equivalent price on carbon. It also includes a rebate on US exports to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. Let's use the actual US and European cases as our example. As the EU plans to implement a BCA, call it a border carbon adjustment, in 2023 through 2026. Right now, the EU has a carbon price of around $90 a ton, and the US doesn't. So US firms don't pay any carbon fee and have an unfair advantage over European competitors who pay that fee. To even the playing field, the EU is planning a European carbon tariff on US industries exports to Europe, making US goods more expensive in Europe. And they will rebate to the EU industry their exports to the US, making European goods cheaper in the US. If the US establishes its own comparable carbon fee to the European price, then the European carbon duties or rebates don't apply. We're back to where we started, basically. So in summary, here's what happens if we don't have a carbon fee and border carbon adjustment like Europe. US exports become more expensive in Europe. European industry becomes more competitive and gains jobs. And European exports to the US become more competitive, hurting US industry. So here's the net effect. The US industry loses sales, both exporting to Europe and here domestically, and jobs if we don't have a comparable carbon price and border carbon adjustment. It's important to note that Japan, Canada, and the UK have expressed support in principle, meaning most of the US trading partners are on board on this policy. I note that in Asia, when the EU announced its policy, newspapers all over the region, Australia, China, Malaysia, and Indonesia, had this on the front page. They knew what this meant for their exports if they didn't put a carbon price in place. So it's a very powerful tool. So which industries are likely at risk? It's those using a lot of energy and those that are in competition internationally. And so they are vulnerable. Which industries are these? It's heavy industries, maybe 10% of the industry groups: metals, minerals, cement, chemicals, fertilizer, pulp. But take note that less than 10% of US industries fall into this category. And most industries' energy costs average about 2% of production costs. Again, here we are about the administration. Is this a heavy load of bureaucratic, new bureaucracies and the like? It's not. It's the Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, and US Customs and Border Protection. Now, an issue that is on the board here is the legality of this. I won't go into some of the WTO provisions, but I do want to mention one that's called Article 20, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades. That's the General Exceptions article, and allows environmental adjustments, a border carbon adjustment, if they are necessary to protect human life, plant health, and related to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. So a border carbon adjustment should meet this exception. And this language actually is in the preamble of our Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that we support. Now, I want to go on to the global perspective here. Why must we have a global perspective, and what's the path to it? We arrive full circle from the first slide. Climate change is global. And CCL working towards a national carbon fee and border carbon adjustment incentivizes other countries. The US policy must, one, address this free rider problem, countries without a carbon fee. Two, incentivize other countries to participate. And three, be a good fit for developing countries with weak institutions, corruption, and income inequality. The CCL policy meets these requirements. Other climate policies do not. So how do you get there? Maybe the most pragmatic and promising path is a multilateral carbon pricing agreement among a subset of nations, such as the G7 countries, with India and China ideally. Call it a club. A club of countries would have a common carbon price and border carbon adjustment that incentivizes others to join. If they put their own price on, then they become a member of the club and they don't have to pay that border carbon adjustment. Recall that the Paris Agreement is based on ambition. It has no enforcement, and I think is unlikely to achieve the necessary reductions voluntarily. So here's a summary of the policy considerations. In terms of the fee, works by raising fuel prices. Steady rising price affects all sectors, innovation and investment. Revenue use, dividend back is the most equitable, protects households and build constituency support. And other options can be regressive, which I'll get to. Border carbon adjustment, unfair competition is addressed, encourages those countries that are free riders to adopt a carbon fee, and incentivizes global carbon pricing and simplifies agreements. I just want to say a few words here about some research findings on regulations and subsidies. So why not regulations, standards, and subsidies instead of a carbon fee? The research and experience shows the following: that subsidies have been inequitable. It's a UC Berkeley analysis. Regulations cost more and are less effective, and well established in many different analyses. Using the revenues from a carbon fee for clean energy subsidies, solar, wind, and efficiency has two equity downsides. First, households don't get the dividend. And second, the clean energy subsidies go disproportionately to higher income households. Only 10% of the benefits went to the bottom 60%. The upper 20% of households received 60% of the benefits. And the most inequitable tax credits were for electric vehicles, where the upper 20% got 90% of the subsidies. Another fiscal factor to consider is the Senate reconciliation bill has two major climate options. They show a dramatic cost difference. The clean electricity subsidies would spend about $250 billion, and the carbon fee would collect $500 billion. So in summary, what does this mean? I think the central message is that the fee, dividend, and border carbon adjustment constitute the foundational policy that is economy-wide and globally connected. And truly complementary regulations and subsidies are also needed to augment the carbon fee and dividend. And when are these subsidies and regulations needed? First, where a carbon fee does not impact a sector's emissions at all, like enteric fermentation, soil carbon sequestration, and where it doesn't impact sufficiently, rental housing, where landlord-tenant incentives are misaligned. You will then need housing codes and energy efficiency. So that is, in summary, I think, the priorities and the reasons we are behind the fee and dividend and border carbon adjustment.
Thanks, Bob. If you want to log your training, if you are interested in following along the trainings that you do in community, or you are motivated by gamification, we have your back. Also, at the end of each training, this one being the economics of carbon fee and dividend policies, you will see this green button, log your training. Click that, same thing. And you can do it through the action tracker. This, I will say, this log your training at the bottom of this page that I'm circling right now, that's what our interactive training looks like with the log your training. And then over here through the action tracker, you just go to chapter and volunteer development, click on that, and then you just start typing the first 4 letters of whatever training you're looking for, and then it will log your training that way as well. You may have more questions. Maybe you can't stay on. You can ask it in the forums, community.citizensclimate.org/forums. You can also visit the Economic Policy Network. The address is on the screen there. It's very long, but it's community.citizensclimate.org/groups/home/1772. You can email Bob Archer himself. You can also email me, but I will tell you, I'm not an economist and I don't play one on TV. So any economic questions, send them elsewhere. You will get much faster answers. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your commitment.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.